All right, so we're going to continue our React introduction series here, and we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We didn't really get a chance to talk about this first objective, controlling state, talking about where to control it and why you want to control it in certain places rather than others. So that'll be our first objective for the day. Sort of related, this could probably even be an indentation here or a sub-objective. I want you to be able to explain what a single source of truth means in the context of a React application. So we'll chat about that. It's very closely related to where we control state and why we control it in certain places. And then we'll implement some conditional rendering. So this is one of the, in my opinion, one of the slickest features of React is that it makes it really easy to do conditional rendering. So only displaying parts of the application if a certain condition is true. We'll probably implement a loading screen so that you can display some meaningful information to your users before data has come back from the API. So focusing a little bit on user experience there. But you can do conditional rendering for all sorts of things in React. So we'll get a little bit of practice with that. And I have a couple resources here that I'm going to ask you to take a look at. These are holdovers from last time. We didn't get a chance to talk about them as much, but we're going to talk about this concept of lifting state up. And then thinking in React is more of a general resource for you to take a look at. They kind of walk through how to translate from a static web app, or sort of like what you have to do with dynos. Take something that's not written in a front-end framework and convert it, or think in ways that allow you to convert it. So that's more of a general reading. So right off the bat, what I really want to do is revisit the idea of this component hierarchy, this architecture, and talk about why we have state where we have it on the app level. So for this application, we're really the only stateful component. The only class component we have, I believe, is this app.js component. So why does the data live here? Why is state controlled here as opposed to somewhere else? So with that in mind, if you'll open up this link here, the lifting up state resource, let's take a look at that. So what I'm going to do, this is a fairly long section. The most important parts, I think, so they go through a whole example of where they're controlling state in various places. And what I want you to focus on is this section here, lifting state up. And in fact, I think the link I have in the resources takes you straight there. So you don't have to worry too much about the specifics of what they're doing in the example. I want you to focus more on the concepts that they're talking about. So they essentially have two components that both have their own state and are keeping their own values. And they discuss sort of why they need to move away from that pattern. So I'm going to throw like a few minutes up on the board, and I would like you to read some of this section. Again, don't get too caught up in the exact example they're implementing, but read through part of this section and or just skip to the bottom here. Sort of the last part of the section, this lessons learned, has some really good information in there as well. So let's do 3 minutes of reading, or 3.5 minutes of reading, and then we'll have some time to discuss. So I'm going to throw a 3-minute timer up and read through that part of the documentation and see if you can pull out some nuggets about state, where state should live, and why that matters. And About 45 seconds or so left. If you're a fast reader and you've gotten through it, you can start jotting down some notes. Again, this lessons learned section is really good. It kind of sums things up. Even though they go through a very specific example, the concepts, as I mentioned, are much more important than exactly what they're implementing. All right, last few seconds wrapping up here. I'm going to stop that before it beeps. And what I'd like you to do now, for those of you remote, you can discuss as a group. We've got a couple people here. But do a turn and talk with your neighbor or with the people that are around you and see if you can come to some consensus together on one or two of the most important points when it comes to state, sharing state, this idea of these common ancestors and whatnot. So Dylan and Jeff, you guys just chat here. And then those of you remote, we'll do like a minute and 30 to discuss together. And then what I'd like each group to do is Slack the remote Plat channel with your thoughts. And we'll just do 2 minutes for both of those together.
I think it's going to be helpful when that goes over. Because like, if I can connect the lessons learned to like what they did in the app example, sure, it can make a little more sense. But basically, you need the state of two different components to be, the same and available with each other. Then they should the prop of their most common parent should be what they're pulling from, not from each other's states.
Yeah, so if you feel like you've got a good consensus, see if you guys can construct a sentence, or you can both Slack some of your thoughts, and just Slack them to the channel, and then since we've got a split group, then we can kind of see what everyone's thinking, and we can discuss it together. Oh no, they're doing. I think they may be using this channel for another lesson. Oh, it is. Okay. 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 Cool.
Well, it doesn't look like React code at all.
So yeah, for those of you who are remote, please Slack some of your thoughts to the channel so we can see what everyone's thinking and then get on the same page together. All right, I'm going to stop this before it beeps obnoxiously. And more sad code. So we're working on this first objective. Where do we want to control state and why does it matter? What is this idea of a single source of truth? So Alyssa has add state to the component that needs it to render, then lift it up from the closest ancestor. So, and Dylan has so is this a quote from the docs?
The
First part. Awesome. So if something can be derived from either props or state, it probably shouldn't be in the state. If you have two components sharing their states, instead of reading each other's states, they should inherit from their closest common ancestor. Cool. So you guys are both really, really close to the mark here. The essence of this is it goes back to the architecture. And We went over that pretty quickly at the beginning of this series, but it's really, really crucial. Well, I mean, it's crucial already to the way our app is functioning because we have our app.js component that is rendering our pose list that is in turn rendering all these poses. And the data flow is very, very important. So that's one thing that we have going on here. The other thing is that we've wired it up so that our pose components through this log click method, which probably should be renamed to delete. But the functionality of this is that when we have the app running, we can click this button and we can remove that pose from our list, right? This is really important in the way our app is architected, but our hierarchy, we kind of have, I wish I could whiteboard for you all right now, but if we just think of the cursor in like empty space here. Like at the top, we have our app level component that passes data down to our list component that passes data down to like a bunch of pose components ultimately. So we sort of have this pretty clear and like straight down structure to our application, architecture-wise. When you're building a more complex application, you're probably going to have more branches in that hierarchy, more branches in that tree, where you may be rendering from your app level component, you may be rendering a couple different components that sort of live as siblings to each other. They live on sort of the same level of the application, which is sort of like the example that they were talking about in the documentation. They've got a calculator component that itself is rendering two components, and ultimately what they want is for these components to be able to share data or communicate with each other. Well, you can't have your components communicate through state unless the components are receiving it through props. So essentially, if you have two components that live, you have one component that lives, imagine these are siblings here. We got one component over here, we got one component over here, maybe there's a component that they share. You hear this term shared ancestor. So they may have components above them that they have in common, but if they're siblings, they don't have a way to communicate with each other. If they each have their own state, that state can never go higher up the hierarchy. So state ideally lives high up and gets passed down through props. And this allows us to change the state in one place and then have those changes be echoed elsewhere. So that's why we wrote this method, this log click method that ultimately is deleting things. We wrote that up here on app level state because ultimately what it needs to do is change the data. And our component can only update when the data, all of our components throughout the application, the way React works on a fundamental level is it's looking for changes in data. And when it detects changes in data that no longer match up with what's actually on the screen, that'll then trigger a re-render, and that component will get recreated and then remounted with the new data reflected. So that's what's enabling our delete button to work. We trigger it all the way down in a pose component, but it's actually firing a method that's tied to the app level state, so it can change the state up there, and then that changes the props that are passed to the pose list, and thus that changes how many poses get rendered. So we create this feedback loop. I'm going to do a little bit of whiteboarding over here. I'm sorry that this isn't going to be on the video. Oh boy. Uh-oh. Shoot, we've lost TV down here. Unplug this, it's probably going to kill